Well, again, welcome everybody. Let's get started. It is time, and I like to start on time. So thanks again for joining us today. We're going to talk about leadership and the power of now. The subtitle later almost always means never. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach this today through the lens of leadership development. We're going to, obviously that's what Path Forward does. So we're going to put it into that context. But I really want you to think about this later almost always means never concept in regard to everything else that you do in your business. So there's kind of two levels as I'm talking about leadership development in this webinar. I want you to be thinking about your culture and your structure and as an organization around accountability, around kicking the can down the road as opposed to getting on issues and moving with them. So two levels. Again, as I'm talking about leadership development, you can put that into any context that you'd like to in regard to the concept of now or never as we're talking about it. So you all, I think almost all of you are familiar with Path Forward. We've been around since 2001 now. We are leadership educators. Our primary product is an extensive longitudinal workshop program. And, some of the things I'll be talking about in the webinar, refer directly to our relationship with our clients and things that we've noticed over the years, but we've been at it for 21 years now, and some of the folks on this call are former clients, and we appreciate that. I do have a question to have you thinking about. Maybe we can get some comments in the chat room. What's your best leadership development practice or strategy that doesn't require budget or approval? Now, we know leadership development is often an activity that needs to be funded in your organization. But one of the things we want to talk about today is some of the things that you can do to forward leadership development without budget. And then the second piece of that is if you want to get support and budget for leadership development activities or programs in your organization, what are some of the things you could be doing to kind of plow the field and prepare your colleagues or your senior leaders to make a commitment and get past later and get into now or make a more specific commitment. So let's start by recognizing that there's a very limited corporate thinking about leadership development. And we've been trying to change this over the last 21 years, but most people still see leadership development as a formal process, something that happens in the classroom. It's driven by the idea that we're developing skills, specific skills like communication and planning and things like that. And these are all legitimate and important skills for leadership. But it's the thinking around leadership development is driven largely by an expectation that what we're doing is we're developing a discrete set of skills for people as opposed to maybe the whole person or the whole level of thinking of the person about leadership. Most people think leadership development is something that happens primarily in the classroom. We make our money in formal programs, so we believe that classroom experience is essential and it's important and helpful. But we also recognize that what happens after our participants in our workshop walk out of the classroom is as important, and in some cases more important than what happens in the classroom. So if people are compartmentalizing leadership development as something that just happens in the classroom, then that's a limit to their thinking about the what's possible, I guess, in regard to developing their people. Most corporate people tend to think that the leadership development function or activity in their organization is the purview of the human resource department or the organizational development department, if you have one. That's very limited thinking, and I think it probably frustrates HR and OD people as much as it frustrates us to have that kind of dumped off on them, rather than for senior leaders and other leaders in the organization to incorporate leadership development as an essential part of their job day to day. Leadership development is also something that tends to be done when we can afford it and when we have time. And it's a nice to have in a lot of organizations. And it's not considered an essential or strategic activity. So, these are things we've run into time and time again over the last 21 years in terms of not thinking of leadership development as a kind of an organic whole, as opposed to thinking of it as something that happens discreetly or specifically in a classroom environment through a formal program. And again, that's coming from people who have a really good formal program and have sold it for many years. But we always talk to our clients about what happens outside the classroom, and we find it critical that leadership sees leadership development in their organization something much more than that formal process. So here's kind of the gist of today's conversation, which is that later often means never. And again, think about this with leadership development, and think about this with other things that happen in your company. So these are some of the things that we hear. We love your program, but we're not ready for it. We'd like to do something, but not until the new budget cycle or until the fall, or when our new CEO gets some time to assess, or until the next lunar eclipse or whatever it is. And we also get the busy thing. We're busy and we don't have time for this. Now, we can argue whether these are legitimate concerns, but what I certainly have learned is that this is just sometimes deflection. This is sometimes an unwillingness to make a commitment. Now, there's two concepts. We talk a lot about accountability in our programs, and there's two concepts that I found are two words, I'll say, that are used all the time that are essentially meaningless. And the first that we talk about a lot is busy. I'm busy. I'm very, very busy. I'm too busy. And we talk to our clients a lot about the kind of uselessness of that word, because it really doesn't tell you anything. It tells you that the person has a lot of work to do, but it doesn't tell you about priorities. It doesn't tell you about choices that need to be made. It doesn't tell you anything about how well the person's managing their affairs or how productive they're being. And we also find that the word busy is often used again as a deflection. So if you need somebody to participate in an activity or even a meeting or a project, I'm too busy is a common response, and we tend to accept that. We tend to say, oh, they're busy, I'll leave them alone. Later is in that same kind of category of words that are used a lot and are essentially meaningless words. When somebody says later, it's a very non-specific response. It's an unhelpful response. It's something that is often designed to simply deflect the conversation. So one of the things I want to talk about today is, how do you challenge later when you hear it? How do you get past later and either turn it into now, or turn it into some sort of choice or decision around action, rather than just this bland later? So I'd ask you to have your little red alarms go off whenever you hear the word busy and whenever you hear the word later, because if you're listening, you'll hear them a lot. I know that in my own personal life, my wife and I are even guilty of it. We'll get to that later. Well, what does that mean? It really means nothing. if we're really being honest with ourselves, it means that I have a kind of a vague intention to do something, but it means that I haven't put it into any sort of planning or set a prioritization or plan. And until it's made part of a plan, or until it's got a date attached to it or a budget or whatever, it just stays in this very amorphous kind of later category. And I think one of the things that we all need to do to be good managers is to get ourselves and others past later and get them into either a point of taking action or choosing not to take action, which is also an action. If you choose not to do something, that is in itself an action. But later is just this big cauldron of good intentions that we have that, in our opinion, and in my experience, my long experience as a business person, really usually means never. Usually means never. When I've trained myself, when I hear a customer say later, first of all, I don't really trust the word. I generally have found that when a customer says, "I'd like to do your program, but we'd like to do it later," that more often than that results in a no sale. It just never happens. So what I try to do is say, okay, what does later mean? Can we talk about this again in 30 days? Can you put it in your new year budget, et cetera, so that we can create something concrete around that commitment. But human beings have a hard time when they want to do something and they feel that they can't do enough, or there's something that they would like to do that they can't get to. They give themselves too much credit for saying, well, I'm too busy, or I'll do it later. And it's just a way for us to feel better about our situation. Like, okay, I'm doing my best and I just can't do that now. I'm either too busy, I'll do it later. And we need to get out of the habit of giving ourselves credit for that statement. It's generally not helpful, and it is, as we've said, it often means never. So continuation of the same conversation. When a prospective customer, that should say, says later, it means one of two things. It'll never happen. There'll always be other priorities, or we're going to make some sort of a cursory effort to do something we call leadership development without having to make a more substantial commitment. When we talk about leadership development, we find that most people want to do it. Most customers see value in leadership development, and most customers would like to do it. What our challenge is, and your challenge is internally within your organization, is turning that from an intention into an action. Now, there's also things you can do to forward leadership development without a budget, without a formal program, and we'll talk about those for a few minutes as well. So there's two paths to help make things happen now, and specifically, again, in regard to leadership development, but again, also in regard to other things that are going on in your organization. You can just overlay this to pretty much anything that you are facing in terms of a corporate challenge. So the first category we're going to talk about is helping your people grow their leadership skills now without formal programs or budgets. If you just simply don't have a commitment in your organization to kind of spend money and time on robust formal leadership development programs, what are some things you can do? And I'm hoping in the chat room that you can also share some things that you do that might help in your organization. So we'll talk about things you can do now rather than later that don't cost money and maybe don't require an approval, up to the senior leadership level. The second category is helping to plow the field with senior leadership so you can ensure budget or resource commitments for formal programs going forward. So if you wanted to do something with us, whether under a Path Forward Leadership Workshop or some other quality leadership program or effort, how do you start getting that later, that good intention into action or commitment? So the first thing when I think about leadership development happening right now, and something that almost any organization can do, is to get their growing leaders interacting with other leaders in the organization. And, I was just talking to a client about this yesterday. And the question I often ask is, how often do your managers in your organization gather for the purpose of talking about leadership and talking about culture and talking about what's going on in the organization? Most management meetings, the vast majority of management meetings in most companies that we've worked with, have to do with tactics and customer issues, supplier issues, upcoming events. And there's very rarely an open forum for a discussion of how are we doing, how can we support each other, and what am I faced with, what do I need your help with? So we call it group coaching, right? We just get people together in a room, and we facilitate those discussions in a way that they don't degenerate into discussions of tactical issues, and they don't degenerate into simply complaint sessions. It's tempting to see this as something that happens after work, in a bar or over dinner or something like that. But I don't think it's impossible for any company to say, once every couple of weeks, we're going to get our management team together for 90 minutes. And we're just going to talk about how we're doing as a team. What does leadership look like? What are we challenged with in our organization right now around leadership issues? And it takes courage sometimes for the people who are forming these groups and facilitating these forums to say, no, that's not what we're talking. We're not, okay, let's not talk about that customer issue that happened yesterday. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Why did that customer issue happen? What as leaders aren't we doing in the organization to help prevent these sorts of things from happening in the future? So the group coaching forums are a really good idea. They're not hard to put together. They don't cost money, and they can be very, very helpful in terms of helping people think more broadly about their leadership responsibilities. The second thing that I think is on that list that I think is an excellent way to get your leaders interacting with each other in a positive way is to have them observe other business functions and departments. I'm in the accounts payable department. I'm going to go out on the floor and watch the manufacturing group make a part, or I'm in the shipping department and I'm going to go in and watch one of the engineers do a CAD drawing, or whatever it is. The ability to observe what is going on in other areas of the business is educational. It creates relationships of more depth between those individuals. It creates greater tolerance and support for what's going on in the other departments. And it just simply broadens the leader's education about the business and how it functions. So, and it's a good idea to have that observation followed up by a planned discussion. What did I see today? What questions do I have about what I saw going on in your department? What possible suggestions might I have about streamlining or reducing waste or whatever? So this is a great leadership development tool, is to just simply have people observe, just sit with their computer, take notes, a clipboard, whatever, to use an old term, and watch what's going on in the other parts of the business, and ask questions, and show respect and gain understanding for what goes on in the other parts of the business. And then exposing leaders to input from important others in the organization, not just their immediate boss. I've kind of despaired around formal mentoring programs because I just haven't seen them work very well. If your company has a formal mentoring program, great, good for you. But hook a couple people up for lunch. You've got a junior leader, you've got a more senior leader, and say, hey, why don't the two of you guys go to lunch? Why don't you connect with each other, learn the ropes from a more senior person? And that can be done informally. It can be done simply by just making sure they're introduced to each other, that there's a handshake and a recognition of that. So there's three ideas. I'm sure you have others, but just the concept here is that leaders, business managers often operate in silos. And it's not intentional because they get busy, they get to work, and all of a sudden they have 1,000 things to do, and they get siloed. And one of your most important leadership development challenges is to get people out of those silos. And these are three ways to do that. The next one is a little bit more amorphous, but I believe in the 21 years that I've been doing leadership development work with Path Forward, I've become more and more focused on culture as a critical issue. Awareness of culture is essential grounding for leaders, and you can help lead dialogue about this in your organization. Again, some recent conversations around with a person who really wanted to raise their game and raise their profile and their leadership influence in the organization. And I asked them, what are the quality of the questions that you're asking? And if you want to be a leader and you want to bring other people along and help them be leaders, you ask good questions. Yeah, we think this is in large part what Path Forward does. We pose good questions. What do we broadly believe to be true as an organization? Why do people act the way they do in this organization? What types of behavior are rewarded and punished in our business? What strengths and vulnerabilities does our culture create for us in the marketplace? What are we doing that solidly grounds us and helps us compete versus what holds us back, right? This is something we talk about extensively in our book, Land on Your Feet, Not on Your Face. Are our collective actions as an organization a result of cultural blind spots, or are we truly open to thinking differently, right? So the question there is, are we simply operating with our current tool set, our current bag of tricks, or are we really willing to leave some of our past behind in order to adopt new behaviors? Certainly the work from home issue is just a classic example of that. I mean, we have a lot of people in the workplace who've never worked in this sort of hybrid environment. And we may have cultural blind spots because of that, right? Because we've always worked in the office together, and we just assume that that's the best way to do things. If we're open to thinking differently, then we can evaluate it objectively and not just based on our cultural blind spots. Again, those of you that know me well know that I talk about this a lot, but success breeds a sort of blindness. When an organization is successful over time, they begin to make all kinds of A to B kind of algebraic conclusions about, we did this and we were successful, therefore we need to do more of this if we want to be more successful. And these are often cultural issues around the way we look, the way we run our meetings, the way we hire, the way we dress, whatever it is. And so beware of your cultural blind spots, call them out. It takes courage to do that, and make sure the organization is really open to transforming and changing the way it needs to. So asking these questions is really important, and you can do that in those forums that we talked about, or you can just start great conversations with the people in your organization in a way that results in them thinking more broadly about their job. And leaders are broad thinkers, right? So these categories of things we're talking about are largely about getting people to think more broadly. They get them out of their narrow tactical siloed focus into a broader sense of being business people who have a strategic and kind of holistic interest in what's going on in the business. And one of the ways to do that is to expose them to other parts of the business, to ask good questions, to constantly be kind of intellectually stimulating. My colleague Steve Matenko and I did a radio program a number of years ago called The Boss Show for a number of years. And one of our guests threw a question at me one day, and they said, what would be your one most important kind of complaint or shortcoming that you see in the leaders that you work with? And it was interesting. I had never really been asked that question before, but I said intellectual laziness as my answer, that leaders have to be thinkers. And people, some people are just natural thinkers. They like to think outside the box. They're very curious people. Most of us will be thinkers to the degree that we're asked to be thinkers, the way that we're encouraged to be thinkers, or the way that we're even required to be thinkers. So a fundamental leadership development in any business is to stretch the intellectual capacity and the cognitive awareness of the individual about what's going on around them. Now, the last thing is really become clearer and clearer to me over the years. If you want to have a great leadership team in your organization, you have to have a strategic plan, and you have to work the plan in a disciplined way. And I could go on for a couple of hours about why I think this is true, but your strategic and operational plans are important vehicles for leadership development. Why? Again, because they cause people to think in a more strategic way about the business. It gets them involved in things that are outside their normal day-to-day responsibilities, right? The second point there, all current and future leaders should be working on projects and initiative-driven activities outside their tactical day-to-day responsibilities. It's good for them intellectually. It's good for them to develop their relationships with other people in the organization. It's good for them to learn about the business. It's good for them to learn to be good project managers. Project management is probably the weakest skill that we observe year to year in terms of our clientele. You ask somebody to do something outside of their day-to-day tactical area, and they really have no idea how to even put together a simple project plan. They struggle with being specific on dates. They'll use terms like later, or I'll get to it when I can. If you have a good strategic plan and a good operational plan, whatever you want to call it, and you're managing that in a disciplined way with a high level of accountability, everyone who's involved in that will have to raise their game in order to meet the commitments and the objectives that have been established. And so this is you driving the organization forward. This is you asking for things to be done now. And this is for you saying what's going to get done this week, what's going to get done this month, instead of saying we'll get to it when we can and being non-specific about that. So last point, bring growing leaders into the biggest possible strategic context and challenge them to think at executive level. Even if your organization doesn't have a broad strategic plan, you can develop one for the department in which you work. The strategic plan doesn't need to be world peace. It doesn't need to be a huge document. It can just be a series of objectives and goals that you establish. And then you take those objective goals and you break them down into step by step. You assign names, you assign dates, and then you follow up to make sure that your managers are learning to be productive and organized in their work. And again, that second point is important. Everybody that you want to grow as a leader in your organization should be working on some sort of project, even if it's out of their immediate area of responsibility, that requires them to interact with people outside their team, possibly even suppliers, vendors, customers, whatever. And you're stretching, you're just constantly stretching people without having to bring them into a classroom for a formal program. So, and then the last thing, again, probably some of you are very good at this, but use widely available and free resources as learning material. There's just my wife and I joke about how often I pull my cell phone out of my pocket to look up data. I've got the Library of Congress in my pocket. There's just a lot of information about out there that's useful, interesting blogs, vlogs, videos, TED Talks, YouTube videos, whatever. And you can create kind of a library and a circulation of those things. You can create dialogue around those. You can follow up with people. Did you get that YouTube video I sent out? Did you find it helpful? And so again, you're stretching the intellectual capacity, the awareness, the strategic thinking level of the people that are working in your organization. And that can be a participant-led activity, right? You can assign people on a rotating basis. Go find an article on the internet that you think is really relevant to our situation and circulate it to a bunch of friends, and then follow up and see what they thought. So we all have access. If we have access to the internet, we have access to an unbelievable amount of information. And I think some organizations use that information, circulate it well. Others could do much, much more. So you might want to think about that as well. So in terms of turning later into now, these are some things, if you want to propagate leadership development more in your organization, if you want to get more support in your organization for doing leadership development, here's just some ideas about how you can plow the field. And if you're getting later messages, if you're getting non-committal messages, how do you turn them into more concrete commitments? I think the first thing, if you don't have a vision, an articulated vision in your organization for the type of leadership you want, you should work on that. And again, you don't need to wait for the HR department to do that. You don't need to wait for the senior leadership to do that. But articulate your best case scenario of what the common practices and standards of leadership should be in your organization. You can even do that for your own department. If you're just in charge of a smaller part of the organization, you can say, within this part of the organization, this is our standard for leadership. This is our vision for leadership. And I think when you do that, I think you just raise expectations, and you can identify gaps. If you don't have a vision, a great practice in business is a gap analysis. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And what are the gap issues in between? So when you're visionary about leadership in your organization, and you really are clear about the kind of people you want and the kind of leadership that you want to see, then the gap between where you are and where and that standard or that vision becomes clearer, and encourages more and more support and activity to do something about it. And it can be a great wake-up call. I think sometimes organizations kind of just stumble forward. They think they're doing fine, but then you put a real vision out there and you say, if we were really great, if our leadership was really strong, this is what that would look like. And then that can be a great wake-up call. I always call it the Applebee's scenario. And if any of you love Applebee's as a restaurant, I apologize. But if you've only been to Applebee's, and that's the best restaurant you've ever been to, you probably think it's really, really good food. If you go to Applebee's and then you go to a 5-star restaurant, you're going to look back at Applebee's and say, well, that was okay, but it wasn't really very good food. So when you create a vision, then there's a greater sense of dissatisfaction about the current state, which is something we identify as a leadership characteristic. Good leaders have this kind of perpetual dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs, and they always know that things could be better. So if you can articulate that and you can be clear about the type of leadership you want in your organization, you'll expose those gaps, and you'll hopefully create better conversation about how to fill those gaps. And if all goes well, you can increase the commitment in your organization to doing meaningful leadership development programs and activities. Another thing that we don't do well in most organizations is we don't make our recommendations strong enough. So if you're aware of a leadership development program, for example, ours, Path Forward Leadership Workshop, evaluate it and present your recommendations to senior leadership in a formal way. One of the deficiencies we find it's very common among leaders in business is they have kind of hallway conversations, or issues come up in a meeting or in a one-on-one or a performance review, and they think they've made their case because, well, I talked to my boss about that, or I talked to my peers about that. Until you make that formal, put it in writing or PowerPoint or whatever, you're not likely to get to a yes or a no. I mean, this is sales 101, right? I mean, until we get a customer to say yes or no, we're kind of nowhere with the customer. And I would rather hear no from a customer than I would hear maybe later. No tells me that there's a gap there between what I want to sell them and what they need. Maybe later, it doesn't give me much to go on. So if you believe that there's something that the organization should be doing, then you should take the time to turn that into a formal recommendation, and that should be presented in a confident and assertive way to the people you work with. And there's a risk to that. There's a risk that they're going to say that's a terrible idea. Take the risk. It's probably worth taking the risk to go in and say, this is something that I believe is important. Here's my research, here's my evaluation, here's why, here's the ROI if you can establish that. But in most companies, it's not enough internal selling. There's not enough, here, I have an idea. I want you to understand my idea. I want you to support it or not. But I can't ask you to give a yes or no to anything which isn't specific and well thought out. So that's another way to turn later into now. Now, here's my last one. So over the years, and this again just happened to me just about a month ago, I get somebody at a lower level of the organization excited about what we do. And that person says, they say that, well, I'm going to go talk to my boss or my CEO about what you do. And honestly, I've started saying, don't bother. If you can't get me in to make the pitch myself, it's probably not going to be very effective. So when an HROD person offers to sell my product for me up the ladder in their organization, the opportunity fails to materialize 98% of the time. So what I'm telling you is, if you have a partner, or a firm, Path Forward or whoever, and you believe that their product would be useful for your organization, get them the opportunity to come in and pitch their product to your senior leadership, and don't try to do it for them. I think I don't want to belabor the point, but you'll get the order more often, far more often, if you allow the person who's expert in the product, who sells the product all the time, to come in and sell it, rather than you trying to explain the product to somebody in your organization. So, and then, insert yourself actively into the budgeting process, right? If there's a line item in the budget that says we're going to spend, $60,000 or $80,000 on leadership development this year in our organization, it's far more likely that that commitment will be followed through, rather than having to go try to get budget money off budget mid-year. So understand the budgeting process that's used in your organization. Try to get yourself in there and actively involved in advocating for budget money for the things that you believe. Again, whether it's leadership development or a new computer system or whatever. Get it in the budget. get whatever you want into the budget as much as you possibly can. It's, again, the bottom line is, if the money's in the budget, it's much more likely to be spent, and it's much less difficult, because when you go then to say, okay, it's time to move forward with that program, and you get resistance, you can say, well, we've already budgeted for this, and so here it is. Why are we now going back on that? Because we've already budgeted. So be an active gadfly in the budgeting process. So the last thing is, don't allow senior leaders to check the box. Now, what I mean by check the box is, leadership development is something that companies love to check the box. They know they should be doing it. They feel an obligation to do it. Their heart might not be in it to the degree that they'd like. So they tend to do kind of little inconsequential things that make them feel good about, oh, we're doing something about leadership development. We sent people to a seminar or whatever. And you want to make sure that the organization isn't just doing inconsequential things just so they could say they did. Hold out for quality efforts and avoid one-time solutions. One of the reasons we feel so strongly about our product is because it's a longitudinal learning approach. It takes place over time, and that's the only real wise investment in leadership development is one that creates a longitudinal learning approach. Single leadership events or seminars can be useful for some people, but in general, retention is low and sustainable behavior change is unlikely. So it's interesting that the objection we get to doing the kind of work that we ask our customers to do with us, which is these longitudinal programs, is often the time commitment more than the actual financial cost. And but you're developing an asset. You're developing a critical asset in your organization, which is a leader, and getting them away from their day-to-day job into a forum, into a cohort, and having them really explore leadership at depth is far better than getting them to a motivational speaker or some kind of single event that maybe pumps them up full of enthusiasm for a few days, but doesn't really teach them at the core what leadership is really about. So make sure that you're doing consequential, transformative things around leadership development in your organization, not just kind of short-term things that feel good. Having a really good speaker come to your quarterly management meeting, it might be a really good idea. Chances are 90 days later, nobody will even remember what the person said. So just be careful about spending money on programs that don't really work. So, I'll open the chat room. That's enough of me just yakking. Do you guys have anything you'd like to say, or question, or share in the chat room? I'll give you a minute to respond if you'd like. If not, we can all go on our way, but I always like to open up the possibility of some interaction. So anybody have anything to say or challenge or suggest? We asked a question at the beginning, what is your best leadership development practice or strategy that doesn't require budget or approval? So you can also respond on that. Jennifer, thanks Jennifer says, thank you, Jim. I'm wondering if you could share more about the process for doing a gap analysis for leadership needs, sharing more about the specifics on how you go about this process. Yeah, Jennifer, I'd be glad to talk to you offline about that. Gap analysis is really a relatively simple thing. It's on one side of the whiteboard or page. You identify the current state. You give an honest assessment of where we are. Our leadership. You can talk about, do we have the experience, the knowledge, the character, the depth of leadership that we need, and where are we? You come out to the other side and you identify the future state. You put words to that future state, and the gap is everything that would need to change between where we are. So for example, if we lack experience, do we need to go out and specifically recruit more experienced managers? Do we need to accelerate the experiential growth of our managers that we have in some way? The gap analysis is just, what do we need to do to get from where we are to where we want to go? It can be a good basis for strategic planning, by the way. If you just do a gap analysis for your business as a whole, it can really help you identify your strategic needs and plans. So again, I'd be glad to talk to you about that offline, Jennifer. If you'd like to reach out to me, we can talk about that at more depth. It's a simple process. Tony George, thank you. Always good to hear from you, and love the reminder about busy and later. I try not to let my employees get away with saying they're busy, but need to do a better job of having folks commit to specific timeframes. Yeah, thank you. I still struggle with it, even though I teach it. I still find myself giving myself too much credit for a non-specific commitment, so it can be a little bit. It can create a little bit of conflict, right? If somebody says, "Well, I'll get to that," and you say, "Well, what does that mean?" Or can you be more specific about when you can get to that? I think, Tony, one of the things that we find when we have those sorts of conversations is we find that sometimes people don't really understand their capacity. And one of the reasons they say later or I'm busy is because they haven't really organized themselves well enough to be able to give you a definitive answer. So if you ask somebody, could you get that done by Friday, for example, they have to be well enough organized in their to-do list, their calendaring, in order to look at that and see and say yes or no. And they also need to be able to say no, right? I mean, you're a nice guy. I know you if somebody has a reasonable no to give you, or if they say that they can't do something, I would imagine you're the kind of leader that doesn't make that an uncomfortable experience. But then the conversation can take even another level, which is, if you can't do it by Friday, what else are you working on that might be able to be delayed till next week so that you could do this instead? So again, the non-specific commitments are just, really not worth much. And they're often driven by a sincere desire. When somebody says later, I often think that they have a very sincere desire to do what you've asked them to do. And they just feel bad that they can't just say yes, and so they're trying to please you in a way. Sometimes when they say later, they're signaling a commitment to doing the work without really planning to do the work, which is very different. We don't have any, just, reminder, Path Forward Leadership stands by to help you in any way we can. We also want to let you know that probably within the next month or so, we're going to be launching a podcast. So you'll all be hearing about that. We're very excited about that. We continue to work with our clients through our leadership workshop program, and it's still a great program. you know, think about it. If there's a space in your organization for doing something really consequential and really meaningful and transformative in your organization, we'd love to talk to you about it. So with that, unless there's any other comments, I'll say thank you very much again for joining us. And we see some new names on here, some people we haven't interacted with before. I'd love to hear from you. Send me a LinkedIn connection request or a message, or just email me at jimh@pathforwardleadership.com. And I just love to talk about leadership. So anybody just wants to get on a Zoom call or phone call with me and you know, share what's going on in your business. There's no obligation to doing that, and I'm always enjoy doing it very, very much. So I'll thank you all. I wish you well, a good and productive day, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.